This is Bob Oliphant from the Westford Historical Society and Museum, bringing you Episode 5 of Season 3 of the Westford Wardsman podcast. The Westford Wardsman newspaper was part of Turner's Public Spirit, a weekly newspaper in Ayer a century ago. In this episode, we'll be reading the Wardsman for the week ending Saturday, January 29th, 1910. I'll elaborate on what was happening in Westford in 1910. The first section of this issue is the About Town section. The weather was temperately wet, so appropriate for the temperate WCTU temperance gathering at the home of Mrs. Emily J. Whitney last week Friday afternoon, when a sale of food was achieved to the deserving hungry. $17 worth of deserving bidders were present and distributed sunshine on this cloudy day. This home is to be congratulated on its generosity in aid of movements to rescue and strengthen normal living. Mrs. Horace Hamblett at Brookside has been ill for a week until good doctor and good neighbor gave life a more healthful flavor. Walter Kimball has completed his bungalow henhouse cottage near Westford Depot and has moved into it, having leased it to himself forever if he likes forever. Mr. and Mrs. Abiel J. Abbott and daughter Carnzu and Selectman Edward M. Abbott sailed last week for a pleasure trip to Italy, Egypt, and the delights of the Mediterranean Sea. They expect to be absent about 3 months. The next paragraph is called Birthday. Mrs. Sarah R. Hildreth, maiden name was Tenny, celebrated her 92nd birthday last week, Friday, January 21st, at the home of her daughter, Mrs. J. Frank Chandler, living on Scribner Hill, north of Westford Town Line in Tingsboro. Mrs. Hildreth will be remembered by the older residents as the widow of James Hildreth, and living for so many years in Westford at the headwaters of our widely known, long-sought-for pond. Only about a year ago, the writer met her and was surprised to find so much that was sparkling and wise wrapped up with the overlaying of so many years. A widow for life, beautifully normal, ere it has been trimmed with the patchwork of illusions. One of her close friends has said of her, "She is 92 years young." This would seem to carry the thought that she is the youngest person in town. The next paragraph is on the Westford Water Company. The annual meeting of the stockholders of the Westford Water Company was held last week Saturday afternoon and elected the following officers: Charles O. Prescott, Treasurer and Clerk; Harwood L. Wright, Auditor; George T. Day, Sherman H. Fletcher, Julian A. Cameron, John C. Abbott, and Charles O. Prescott, Directors. At a subsequent meeting of the directors, George T. Day was elected president, Sherman H. Fletcher, general manager, and Alonzo H. Sutherland, superintendent. I believe he'd been the superintendent since the water company was formed several years ago. From the annual report, which has just been issued, a few condensed facts will serve to show the standing of the company. There are at the present time 263 water takers, an increase of 46 over last year. The main pipe has increased in Graniteville and at the center of town 1,767 feet, making a total length of 8½ miles of main pipe. The standpipe on Prospect Hill has been strengthened to resist increased breezes from the direction of the North Pole, since that point has become such a breezy, controversial radiator. The driven wells have been tested by 2 exceptionally dry seasons. The best of experts are they at pumping water, and yet neither they nor the pumping station have been able to exhaust the requirements and expectations of the water company or the public. 2 barns and a forest fire at Graniteville tested the effectiveness of the supply and the wisdom of those who contributed the foundation. The financial report shows a considerable increase in revenue over fixed charges as compared with last year, which showed a deficit. From all points of view, the Westford Water Company is to be congratulated and encouraged on its past achievements and its future outlook. The total amount of water pumped to the standpipe for January 1st, 1909 to January 1st, 1910 was 14,503,098 gallons. The next section is on the Farmers Institute. The few unintentional and harmless words sent forth at after-dinner exercises at the Institute at Westford on the, quote, milk standard, end quote, question has fanned the old fire into a flame, and the whole fire department of oratory has been summoned to either quell the flame or else make more of it. Consequently, the Institute in February will discuss resolved that the standard of milk should be abolished for the good of all. The affirmative will be led by Mr. Emerson of Haverhill, one of the largest milk raisers in Essex County, and as co-partner that Superintendent of Breeze, DeLacy Corkum of Billerica. Both are already preparing for a rapidity of overturn that is liable to result in buttermilk before they get through. While the negative speakers have not yet been named, it is expected that two able consumers, in more senses than one, will be selected, both gentlemen living in Lowell. Got it, gentlemen? I will hold hats or fans, or, in the event of both sides getting weary, I will administer the medicine both are crying for, milk and water for the affirmative, cream and milk for the negative. Then we shall see what diet gives endurance to the end. By the milk standard, I think they're talking about the allowable fats in the milk, which is set by the state board. The next section is the Westford Center section. A little daughter named Alberta has been born to Mr. and Mrs. Clarence A. Reed, which is the fifth child in their family. She was born on January 9th, 1910. And this family spells their name R-E-I-D, or at least it's spelled that way in this issue of the Wardsman. R-E-A-D and R-E-E-D are also family names in Westford and more common than R-E-I-D. Mr. and Mrs. James D. Wilson also welcomed another little daughter. Her name was Frida E., born January 15th, into their home last Saturday. Many who were interested Wednesday evening enjoyed the spectacle of a fine sunset at the close of a beautiful winter day, and then the appearance in the mist of the Innes comet, I-N-N-E-S comet, which showed up finely. With brilliant Venus a little to the left, and in the east the nearby full moon rising, and myriads of other stars, it was one of nature's splendid sights. This was also called the Great January Comet of 1910, and also referred as the Innes Comet or the Daylight Comet, was probably the brightest comet of the 20th century. When first noticed, it was visible to the naked eye, and hence was, quote, discovered by many people. Robert T.A. Innes, born in 1861, died in 1933, of the Transvaal Observatory in Johannesburg, South Africa, was the first astronomer to properly study the comet. Mrs. John Warren has been and still is ill with an attack of heart trouble. Miss Grace Lumbert is caring for her. The next couple paragraphs are on the Teachers' Social. The annual event in the social calendar of the Congregational Church, known as the Teachers' Social, took place at the vestry Tuesday evening, and this coterie of bright young ladies gave their hearers an hour or so of wholesome fun that was bright and original to a degree and much appreciated. It was to be regretted that the weather and traveling was such that many who had planned to attend were detained at home. The class color was brilliant red, and the class gift a happy, grinning Billiken. The graduating costumes were wonders of girlish finery, with their wealth of ribbons, bracelets, chains, etc. Also, the costumes of the faculty and school committee were quite remarkable. The Billiken referred to here was a charm doll created by an American art teacher and illustrator, Florence Pretz, P-R-E-T-Z, of St. Louis, Missouri, who is said to have seen the mysterious figure in a dream. In 1908, She made the Billiken, who was elf-like with pointed ears, had a mischievous smile and a tuft of hair on his pointed head. His arms were short, and he was generally sitting with his legs stretched out in front of him. Supposedly, to buy a Billiken gives the purchaser good luck, but to have one given to you is better luck. The Billiken should not be confused with the baby-like Kewpie figures, it's spelled K-E-W-P-I-E here, that debuted in the December 1909 Ladies' Home Journal. There were many bright local hits, and genial John Wright added the finishing touches when he presented the diplomas to this promising class. The class orchestra was certainly an ingenious medley of music. At the close of the entertainment, refreshments of cocoa with whipped cream, sandwiches, and cake were served, and a social hour enjoyed. A pretty little side feature of the evening was the presentation to Mrs. Marshall, she was the pastor's wife, of a beautiful bunch of pinks which graced the piano during the evening for her ever helpful skill at the piano at this and other recitals. Next, we have a few paragraphs on the Grange. There was a good attendance of the members of the Grange at the town hall last Thursday evening, and the newly elected lecturer had prepared a good program. Speaking of newly elected officers, every one of the new staff, with one exception, were in their places. This also included the executive committee. The master's gavel sounded promptly at 8 o'clock, with the result of getting through a good session of business, the lecturer's program, and considerable sociability, all within a seasonable hour. The lecturer had ready for distribution the newly printed program for the year, in neat gray covers with much material of promise within them. The program for the evening was in charge of the men. The play named The Third Degree, which they hoped to have ready for presentation, was not quite ready, owing to a succession of stormy nights for rehearsals. This will be given in the near future. Samuel L. Taylor furnished some of his enjoyable recitations, his oration on, quote, the apple, end quote, in Negro dialect being particularly good. Everett Woods and Horace E. Gould also gave some good recitations in humorous vein. Cyril A. Blaney, M.D., and Edson G. Boynton furnished songs that were thoroughly enjoyed. The play that they didn't do, The Third Degree, is a play in 4 acts written and published by Charles Klein in 1908, so it was a relatively new play at the time. Quite a number from the Grange attended the meeting at Littleton last week, Wednesday evening, when the 3rd and 4th degrees were conferred on a large class of candidates. The 3rd degree being done by their ladies' degree staff. A fine oyster supper was served. Oyster suppers seem to be very popular, at least in the winter in Westford 100 years ago. The next section is the Forge Village section. The Groton School Orchestra will give their annual concert in Reception Hall in the near future. The Groton School was a private school run by the Episcopal Church in Groton. Among many other well-known people that went to school there was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and I believe all of Theodore Roosevelt's children. Michael LeDuc, a Pole, it says here that he was a Pole, meaning from Poland, but I believe he was actually a French-Canadian, had his right arm broken Wednesday afternoon while employed in the mill of Abbott and Company. Dr. O.V. Wells set the injured member. Miss Genevieve Janston of Lowell was a visitor at Cameron School Wednesday. Miss Janson was a former teacher. That's spelled J-A-N-T-S-O-N. George Howard, a former clerk of Conant and Company, Littleton, is to be taken into the above-named firm as a partner the first of the month. Mr. Howard was a drummer for a well-known wholesale firm of Boston. His many customers will be pleased to have him on his former route. The next paragraph is called Dance. The members of the John E. Edwards Host Company held its 2nd annual dance in Abbott's Hall Friday evening, January 21st, which was attended by a large number. Dancing was enjoyed from 8 till 1. McNally's Orchestra of Hudson furnished the music. At 10:30, an oyster supper, cake, and coffee was served in the anterooms. The night proved to be a stormy one. Rain fell in torrents, and the streets were in a slippery condition that made traveling almost impossible. Nevertheless, a large number of people from Graniteville came by way of trolley. Visitors were also present from Groton, Ayer, and Littleton. The Westford Fire Department were detained at home by the storm, but aided the Treasury by purchasing several tickets. The committee in charge of the affair were Edward T. Hanley, Walter Precious, John W. Catchpole, and James Whigham. The ladies in charge of the supper were Miss Hannah Colburn, Mrs. R.D. Prescott, Mrs. George Sanborn, and Mrs. George Weaver. After all expenses were paid, a balance of $21 was turned into the Treasury. The next section is called Deaths. The many friends of Reuben Orange will be sorry to learn of his death, which occurred at 4 o'clock Saturday afternoon in Providence, Rhode Island, after a long and painful illness of blood poison. Mr. Orange came to this village, we're talking about Ford's Village here, from Bradford, England, 23 years ago, with his parents, the late Mr. and Mrs. Abraham Orange. While still a young boy, he moved with his parents to Worcester, where he had the misfortune to be run over by a freight train and had one foot amputated. The family moved back to this village again, where they resided for many years. When St. Andrew's Mission was founded, he became one of the leading singers in the choir. He also sang frequently at concerts and was a moving spirit in the life of the town. A few years ago, he went to Providence, Rhode Island, where he learned the trade of plumber. He leaves to mourn his loss a wife, Susie, 2 small children, 3 sisters, Mrs. Samuel Blowy and Miss Elizabeth Orange of this village, and Mrs. Joseph Perkins of Graniteville, and 2 brothers, William Orange, who was in Company I, 11th Infantry, now at Fort Russell, Wyoming, and Joseph Orange, formerly of the USS Vermont, but now Company C, 1st Regiment, stationed at Cavite, Philippine Islands. His age was 28 years. Funeral service was held Tuesday at 1 p.m. at the Roger William Baptist Church, corner of Westminster and Knight Streets, K-N-I-G-H-T Streets, Providence, Rhode Island. The next section is the Graniteville section. The heavy rains for the past few days have caused the snow to rapidly disappear, but left the roads in a very icy condition. It is neither sleighing nor good wheeling at the present time. Mrs. Jemima Carmichael, mother of J.B. Carmichael, is now quite ill at her home in this village, and at time of writing very low. The Pony Club will hold a social dancing party in this village on Saturday evening. I believe that was a social club made up of young women in Graniteville, rather. The smoke talk that was to have been held at the rooms of Court Graniteville 179 F of A, that's Foresters of America, on last Thursday night has been postponed till the first meeting night in February. At the 9:45 o'clock Mass in St. Catherine's Church on Sunday morning, Reverend J.J. McNamara gave a very able sermon on, quote, the Holy Name, end quote, which made a deep impression on the large congregation present. Reverend Samuel H. Armand, who has been the pastor of the Methodist Episcopal Church in Graniteville for nearly 2 years, has resigned his position and left here Tuesday morning for his former home in Indiana. Later, both Mr. and Mrs. Armand will take up missionary work in the Philippines. The best wishes of his former parishioners here go with them in their chosen work. A son, Alvin R., was born to Mr. and Mrs. Stephen Healy of this village Tuesday morning, January 24th. Michael J. and John F. Rafferty left here this week for Boston, where they both have accepted positions. There was a special meeting of the St. Catherine's Temperance Society in the rooms of the organization on Wednesday evening. A little daughter named Evelyn M. was welcomed into the home of Mr. and Mrs. William Robinson of this village on Wednesday, January 26th of this week. That's the news in Westford for the week ending January 29th, 1910. Thank you for listening, and thanks to Ryan Cousins of WestfordCAT for providing technical support. You can find transcriptions and podcasts from the Wardsman at our website at museum.westford.org, or visit the Historical Society's Facebook page for more Westford news from a century ago. This is Bob Oliphant, and I hope you will join us for next week's Westford Wardsman podcast. Thank you.